Hello and welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. I hope you all had a very Merry Christmas. One man that I know feasted like the three wise men themselves was Fash, the $1 Million Fan. Fash, how are you doing?
I am very well, Wax. And yeah, I did have a good time over this festive period. But I wouldn't say I was the only one that was living the high life. I think you've obviously signed a new contract with the World Podcast Federation, and that was very visible in your actions. But here we are post all of this, similar to yourself, wishing everyone really a great lead up to the new year, and hope you all had a great Christmas festive period. While we're here, Wax, a show that we've been building up to for a while. Certainly, if you factor in our little hiatus as well, a big show, more so for, I guess, all the changes and the behind the scenes stuff rather than what was in the ring. But very happy and very excited to talk about today's big event.
Absolutely, which is Survivor Series 1992. Before we do kick off though, Fash, obviously, everybody, thank you very much for your support so far on this podcast. We're hoping to ramp up the episodes of the next wee while, hopefully get a lot of content out. We're trying to now meet the 30-year timeline almost. 30 years ago, this event happened, and hopefully we'll follow that over the coming months as well. Please do like on Twitter and Instagram, subscribe to our pages, subscribe to YouTube, our channel, Wrestling with Memories. Is very easy. Just search in any search bar. We'll be up there as one of the top listings, no doubt. A lot of really good content. And if you want to find out what's happening in the run-up to Survivor Series 92, check out our channel. But the show itself, Fash, 30 years ago almost, not really a typical Survivor Series from what we were used to at this point.
Yeah, and like you said, we really, if you go back to our episode 29, I think, it really starts the wheels in motion in terms of all the changes that have happened up to this show. So we've covered everything, the debuts, the departures. We look at the Warrior, we look at the British Bulldog, we look at the Mountie. Last episode, we looked at the perfect face turn. It's all leading to this event on November 25th, 1992 in the Richfield Coliseum. Interestingly, Wax, the 1987 and 1988 versions of Survivor Series, so the first two took place in this arena as well. And I see a lot of issues going into this, which we'll get into. A lot of changes to the card. So obviously the main event changed from what was supposed to be the Ultimate Maniacs versus Rick, Flair and Ramon. Warriors gone, Perfect's in. At one point, the Mountie was supposed to challenge the British Bulldog for the Intercontinental Championship. They're both gone. Shawn Michaels is now the Intercontinental Champion. He will take on Bret Hart, who is the World Champion. So it's champion versus champion, but only the WWF title is on the line. And then there's lots of other things going on as well. But I don't know. I remember this event really vividly because, we've talked about in the past WrestleMania 8, SummerSlam 1992, but this is one that I actually remember the most over this period. It was one of my friends. He recorded this event. It wasn't you on this occasion. And he brought it over to my house and we watched it, I think, a couple of nights after the event, with some food. So I do remember this kind of from start to finish. And I guess in terms of the event itself, going into it, what did you think about the card in general?
Well, I think we were all a little bit disappointed not having, the Ultimate Warrior on the card. Maybe I'm not even sure we realized the full extent of why, but we discussed obviously in our previous podcast. But I think not having the Ultimate Warrior, who is probably the biggest character wrestler of that year, post Hulk Hogan, was disappointing. But for me, as a Bret Hart diehard fan, it was awesome to see Bret Hart main eventing for, the first time as a world champion in one of the big four events. One of the really interesting things, Fash, about this era of WWF was they always used to have these lead-up shows to the big events. And in this particular case, the Survivor Series Showdown event, which I think only ran a couple of years. But any thoughts on that particular event or this approach to doing these big events?
Yes, I'm not sure. You might recall if you used to get these events on Sky. I hadn't seen it at the time. I've seen it later on the WWF network or WWE network. And of course, this one came under the radar, a couple of years ago, because they put on the actual show on the network, but also bonus footage And I see these shows are really a final kind of hype show leading into a pay-per-view. If you look at the card for this show, it wasn't a great card. It was more about just kind of sending that message of, big pay-per-views coming up. It took place on the 22nd of November, so 3 days before. But the interesting thing about this show was that it was patched together just like this pay-per-view. So the actual matches were recorded on the 26th of October. This date is very important. We have covered it in our archives because a number of happenings happened there and then translated TV later on. I think the interesting thing is more what we didn't see on the event. So in terms of kind of broad stuff that happens here, Vince McMahon has a sit-down interview with Bret Hart and really try and push him as, the new face of the company. You see Marty Jannetty having a match on this, I think, against the Brooklyn Brawler. Earthquake takes on IRS. And, there's a few other segments. One which I remember was The Undertaker building Kamala's coffin. But there's not a lot there that's interesting. What they're really trying to bring into this show is that big change that people might still not be aware of if you've not watched primetime wrestling or Saturday night's main event, and that is the fact that the Warrior's gone, Mr. Perfect's in, and they've got a couple of interviews spliced in here to really convey that. The other thing which is interesting, Wax, they have a rerun of Shawn Michaels' match with the British Bulldog. On this with Shawn actually commentating. So they've recorded this after. The reason I'm saying all of this stuff, there's a green screen, which is very obvious when you watch the show. The stuff that we didn't get to see was the debut of Jimmy Garvin in the WWF. Now, this is a one and done deal. And I think if you watch his segment where he comes out as a kind of heel announcer, Mean Gene's interviewing him, he was terrible on the mic. But he's talking about the Ultimate Maniacs. He's talking about the card that was supposed to be. We don't ever see him on TV. So this is one of the kind of bonus footage, which I would encourage anyone to go and see if they haven't. There's a couple of dark matches. There's Razor Ramon and the Macho Man. There is the Ultimate Warrior versus Nailz, which is very quick. The Warrior wins that. Nailz actually pulling double duty here. He also has a match with the Big Boss Man, which Nailz actually wins after a nightstick shot. And we'll talk about the actual match of Survivor Series and why the outcome maybe was what it was. And Bret Hart's on double duty as well in these dark matches. He beats the Mountie in a minute. This is something we've covered in the archives, and this is the Mountie's last appearance. And he also defeats Papa Shango, who really has no value in the company right now. So it's interesting more, it was a lead-up show. They can't show us a bunch of stuff because of the changes. They've spliced some other stuff in. I've watched it recently again. It's pretty lackluster, but they really had their hands tied behind their back at this point.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the show itself, Fash. As you mentioned, in the Richfield Coliseum in Ohio, 1992. We've got Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan opening up the show. I think tried and tested duo by this point, and I think it really played into the event as a whole because Bobby Heenan was involved in this feud with Mr. Perfect alongside Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. So his commentary throughout, his focus throughout the show is very much on Mr. Perfect and that particular match. So I thought it was an enjoyable combination for me throughout the whole event.
See, I liked them as a combination. What was interesting for me, though, was this was the second pay-per-view in a row here where it was both of them because it did SummerSlam. I remember at the time thinking, why is Gorilla Monsoon not the main play-by-play guy here? He obviously was at the Royal Rumble. He was at WrestleMania. He's going to come back for the next Royal Rumble. So I think they were still kind of, I guess, umming and ahhing over who's the lead announcer for these pay-per-view events. But I enjoyed this combination. It's not as fun as the Gorilla Monsoon Bobby Heenan combination. No. But obviously Vince is probably trying to really deliver some key messages, and maybe that's why he's the one taking the lead here.
Yeah. A quick opening match for us, Fash. It's High Energy, the team of Coco Beware and Owen Hart, both legendary performers in my eyes, against the Headshrinkers. I actually thought this was a really good start to the show. It was quite a fast-paced start from High Energy, going by their name. But in the end, obviously, High Energy come up a little bit short. I thought Owen Hart looked an absolute star in this match.
Yeah, I think, Coco Beware being a legend, that's debatable, but, I guess depends what your definition of a legend is. This was all about a showcase for the Headshrinkers, wasn't it? We've covered them, their debut, and, all the changes that took place there after the initial appearance. They haven't really been promoting this match on television leading up to this, so it's your classic kind of opener. Owen was good. I think really the formula of this match, and it's similar to other tag team matches we saw in this era, and indeed a little bit like the main event. You've got Owen kind of starting things off, takes a bit of a beating. Coco Beware makes the hot tag. Then eventually Heenan tags in Owen with a couple of drop kicks, I think, from the top rope, but then goes for another one, gets caught by Samu, and then you'll remember the classic finisher of the Headshrinkers with Fatu on Samu's shoulders and kind of big splash.
Yep.
That gets the victory. For me, though, what I remember of this time, it's going back to say, I remember seeing this event was actually Afa eating that big.
I knew you were going to mention that.
Yeah, chicken leg. I remember this at the time, and I remember somebody in the room, in the language of Punjabi, saying the sweary word, is eating a chicken, and that's the only impression that was made on that bystander. Well, so for me, it was all about that than the actual match. And the other thing that I'd note here was the brain scan.
Yep.
Bobby Heenan's.
We've seen this a couple of times.
Yeah.
I'm drawing funny pictures on the screen, relating to the match. I thought it was hilarious. I think Bobby Heenan's just great commentary, isn't it, all the way through?
Especially go back and look at it, he was just a genius. I guess the other thing that I would note for this match, I say it's all about showcasing the Headshrinkers. Owen Hart's had quite a odd year in 1992, so he starts off the year part of the new foundation and will get sacked. He's then having a singles match at WrestleMania 8. Then he's in this tag team, High Energy, not really doing much, and then they lose this match at Survivor Series. So he just seems a little bit, out of, recognition. And nothing much from Tabin Coke Beware. I guess he looks like he's on his last legs here as well. He's kind of been through his period.
Coco's been around for a while. Owen Hart, I mean, to be fair, he's just in the business really, or just in the WWF at that point, although he'd been in the business for a very long time.
Well, he'd been remember he was the Blue Blazer back in the day, but yeah, you're right. I guess they're playing the fact that he is Brett's brother, but not too much.
Yeah.
But we'll see him really come into his own in the coming months. But yeah, I think it was a fair opener, kind of high energy, pun intended, opener, but really very short, but 7 minutes or so. But it got across the key message, which was, the Headshrinkers are serious contenders.
One of the big stories that were running up to Survivor Series 92 was obviously our next match, all between the Big Boss Man and Nailz. We covered Nailz' introductions to WWF in a fair amount of detail, so please do check out the archives. Prior to the actual match happening, you've got a couple of promos, one from Nailz, who I thought was very believable as an innocent bystander to whatever accusation Big Boss Man has put on him and put him behind bars. So, free Nailz is all I got to say on that. And then the Boss Man with his with standard promo with the nightstick in hand. And this is a very special type of match, Fash.
It's a nightstick on a pole match, and Vince Russo is nowhere to be seen. Okay, so he was not the guy that started the something on a pole. I say I love the promo from Nailz because he's just, comes across so believable. I think it's like the Bruce Pritchard thing, when the bell rings, the problem starts, but he's so good here. And yeah, to your point, Bossman entered this, if we're looking at kayfabe, this company as a bad guy back in 1988. So why wouldn't Nailz be an innocent man? I think Nailz was the actual babyface here, but nobody got to see. We never really. I think the Bossman was the bad guy here, but yeah, Bossman cuts a promo with Mean Gene as well. Interestingly, this version on the WWF network that we're watching is cut down version. There's also a Coliseum home video, Silver Vision. You remember that as a UK person version of it, where they have other interviews and segments as well. So I think there's another segment with the boss man, Lord Alfred Hayes, where he pretty much says the same stuff. But yeah, this is an interesting match. I mean, leading into this was one of the ones I remember we were excited about because you just didn't know what you were going to see. And they had built up this feud, a true blood feud, so well.
Yeah, it was actually been running since well before SummerSlam. It's probably several months worth of feud. And, you say it's shortened match on this version, probably a good thing, I think, for most people. It was pretty much just a brawl, punches being thrown. That was pretty much all that was happening for the majority of the match until the boss man actually gets the nightstick, but doesn't do any damage with it, and Nailz gets a hold of it. But mercifully, it was a fairly quick match with a quick finish. And I think crowd were really on fire for the finish for this because they really wanted to see the boss man pay back Nailz.
Yeah, and to your point, they say Nailz has the nightstick, doesn't do much damage, and then ultimately the boss man hits the boss man's thumb, gets a quick pin. What I liked going into this, though, is just the believability, because even when the match begins, Bossman doesn't wait for his music to start. He kind of finishes his promo, he sees Nailz is coming out, and they do this kind of split screen, which is a little bit different for the time, and he just runs to the ring, and they start fighting one another, which adds to the fact that this is not a wrestling match, it's a fight. Yeah, I mean, Nailz didn't really do much as a character. It was a lot of choking more than anything else. But the finish, Wax, I think this was the wrong outcome. I mean, in hindsight, it wasn't, because we'll talk about what happened to Nailz after this. But I said leading into this, in that dark match, Nailz did defeat the Boss Man. And I have a feeling that he may have won this match as well if it wasn't for all the other changes that took place. I know recently in Bruce Pritchard's podcast, he's mentioned maybe it was about the crowd going home happy, at least with some outcomes.
Yeah.
And that was it. Now, you might say, well, this is the Boss Man's type of match, he should win. Well, they're not going to do much with the Boss Man over the next few months. And what's odd about this is, before this feud is finished, they've already kicked off another feud, The Undertaker and Nailz, which we've mentioned in the archives as well, because on the 24th October episode of Superstars, they have that great face-off. Interestingly, that face-off then appears in the January 1993 WWF magazine, which won't work out when we discuss what happens after this event. But I just feel that because they were setting him up against The Undertaker, there was also some promos with The Warrior and some matches going on. That is a very odd outcome, but maybe you need to factor in everything else that happened. But
I think that this feud could definitely have gone a couple more rounds. Nailz obviously defeated here, could have picked up a win and then gone to a decider later on.
That's what was going to happen. I don't even think they were going that far. I think at this point it was going to be Nailz Undertaker, if you really think as well, maybe going into WrestleMania. And the gravest challenge between them. I think we could have a lot of fun, but we'll talk about that another time. But for me, the match was more about the spectacle.
And just a point on the spectacle, this wasn't the only something on a pole match in this particular period. There was actually a WCW coal miner's glove on a pole match a couple of months, a month before, actually, just at Halloween Havoc between Jake Roberts and Sting. So I wonder if somebody got the idea from watching that event about putting something.
Well, I mean, if you would have watched that match, you probably would
avoided it, yes.
From it, but that's a good point. That was something, and I think, like I say, it worked for this. One thing I should probably note here, Rax, and we've not touched upon, is this Survivor Series format is very different to anything else we've seen up to this point. It's not teams of 4, teams of 5, barring one match. And now 1991 Survivor Series, which we've also reviewed in the archives, that had a mix of the traditional matches. And if you they had a singles match, they had a 6-man tag. Here they've just thrown away the formula, barring one match, which was really odd, and it's more about kind of blood feuds. Before we go into the next bit, what did you think about that format?
I didn't like that.
I didn't like it either. I didn't like it.
I was a big fan of the 4v4, 5v5 match, or sometimes 8v8 or 10v10, which they had in the tag team division. I actually really enjoyed that format, and it was something very different to the other shows, and I was a bit disappointed that they went away from that here. They'll kind of go back and forth with it for the next few years, but really it kind of stuck with mostly single matches and then the big main event, something along those lines.
Yeah, and I think maybe they didn't feel it works at the end of this, because next year, as you say, we're back to the traditional one, but it's one that they've, I guess, continually kind of flip-flopped on. But at the time, I don't recall liking it, and even today watching it, I was kind of working out what could I have done if it was 4 matches. But then it also points maybe to the roster is so thin right now that maybe you can do it. Anyway, the next, I think we moved to a segment, which is just a backstage interview.
I mean,
Flair and Mean Gene, and it's covering the same kind of stuff that they've done. I think it's just really demonstrating to the audience again. If you've not watched the stuff leading up to this, we're really annoyed with Mr. Perfect.
Gene certainly earns his money on this event, doesn't he, with the multiple promos. The next match is a feud that seems to have been going on for some time as well. Tatanka versus Rick Martel. I know you're not a big fan of either at this point in their careers, potentially. I think the most interesting thing about this match was Doink's appearance. It was not a great match, pretty boring. They kept everything on the mat, really slow, sluggish. But Tatanka did pick up the clean win to sort of put him over and cement him his sort of future.
At that point, actually, probably the most I like Tatanka, because this was in the kind of undefeated streak period. But I just didn't see the point of this match. They've already fought at WrestleMania 8. Tatanka won that. This is all built upon Rick Martel stealing Tatanka's eagle feathers, which are sacred to him. And they have a match, but it's nothing. Is like they're not really doing much with Martel. Tatanka's obviously being pushed, but I would have preferred at this point if he was taking on a new opponent. And really taking him rather than a rehash. And similar to you, I thought Doink in the aisle playing his tricks and then, bursting balloons, etc., was way more entertaining than the match. Tatanka does win. He reclaims his feathers. Something we don't see on the network version. I think there is a kind of post-match interview with his lordship, where Tatanka, is very happy to get those feathers back. But yeah, it was a nothing match. I didn't see a need to kind of reignite this feud after they'd taken each other on earlier in the year.
Yep. Up next, we have a promo with the opponents of Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. It's obviously the perfect duo of Mr. Perfect and Macho Man. One thing I was going to note here, I think Mr. Perfect's promos are very underrated. I think he's actually tremendous on the mic. I don't know if you agree, but I think people talk about Flair a lot. I think Mr. Perfect was just as good.
No, I think he's great. I think you do think more of Mr. Perfect of the kind of stunts he pulled, the kind of perfect stunts and things. And as a cocky heel, he's great. It was a little bit odd seeing him as a babyface and playing that dynamic, but to your point, I think he was perfect in this role. Pun intended again, because it's Ric Flair on the other side, Razor Ramon. This is this great angle that is continuing. So I did think he was excellent here, and there's a little bit of tension with the Macho Man. It's perfect really on his side, but I think the whole dynamic made this work. And yeah, I think when you think of Mr. Perfect, you don't always think about the promos, as you say.
Yeah.
But his first run as a color commentator was good. Maybe the second one wasn't as good. And being Ric Flair's mouthpiece was brilliant. But yeah, I think he is vastly underrated when it comes to somebody speaking on the mic and playing that character. What do you think, Wax, about going into this match? Razor Ramon, we've talked about this super push. You got people forget this coming into the company. Did you think he was ready for this? Does it still feel odd looking back 30 years ago that this guy who kind of debuted after SummerSlam was now main eventing one of the big shows?
Yeah, I think he had the look, didn't he? And they really pushed his character. The fact that he got involved with Macho Man losing the title made it seem important that he was part of the act. And, if they had to split up Mr. Perfect and Flair, I think they did it pretty well by adding Razor Ramon into the mix. I mean, I thought he belonged pretty quickly.
They pushed him as a big guy. He belonged. I think if you would watch WCW at this point, you would have been like, what's the Diamond Stud doing in WWF main event? But I, at the time, hadn't seen the Diamond Stud, didn't know the history of Scott Hall, but it was still odd to me at him seeing this new guy suddenly can propelled into this position. But the characters together worked, and I thought he was great in the promos. He showed the real anger of what had taken place. And yeah, that kind of dynamic with Macho Man was working really nicely. What did you think of the match itself and the kind of story they were trying to tell? I've certainly got views on it, but keen to hear any views that you have.
No, I enjoyed the match. I thought it was a very solid match. 3.5 stars from me. I think they played. No, I don't think so. I think it's 4 pretty good workers in the ring, telling a story, of Macho Man really taking a lot of the punishment. Mr. Perfect on a couple of occasions really thinks, what's the point? Or, have I got in over my head in this one? And, he's walking down the ramp a couple of times, as if he's going to... Does it once, and...
Don't do your Piers Morgan propaganda. I think he does it once during the match.
He does it once, but there's multiple moments where he's looking like, he's either had enough or, what am I doing here sort of thing. Or he just feels like giving up. And then when he does walk halfway down the aisle, that's when the sort of fans really sort of come together and cheer, and he hears them, and then he comes back and, shortly after Macho Man gets the hot tag to him. I thought the match was well put together. I didn't like the finish necessarily, but I understand why they did it, to protect everybody involved, and just take this feud forward. I don't know. I mean, you obviously didn't like it.
No, I liked the match. I 3.5. I mean, I was, kind of ratings are always subjective.
Yeah.
I think, if you're doing a 5 scale, I'd probably give it a 3 rather than 3.5. I know that's being pedantic, but I tell you what I felt was interesting here. Obviously, Mr. Perfect was not prepared for this. This wasn't supposed to happen. So I think he's great for what he does. But yeah, they do protect him. He probably doesn't look in peak condition here, right? Got a bit of a pot belly like the Wax. But he comes out and he's going to get into shape soon. But I think, the play was make Perfect look great. So, I love the kind of beginning with Razor Ramon. It wrestles him with Ric Flair as well. And then, as you say, Macho Man's playing that face in peril, and eventually getting the hot tag again, and you see Perfect doing the perfect plex on Ramon, you see him doing the perfect plex on Flair. There's a ref bump, 2 referees in the ring, and then we get chaos. and it's a victory to the Perfect team by disqualification. I just felt that the ending was a little bit lame, but then to your point, they're trying to protect everyone, but they didn't really carry things forward, and we'll get to that in our next episode. Certainly with the Macho Man, they didn't.
There always seems to be a reason why these things never sort of carry on, and I think they're very hampered in that storyline from that storyline perspective.
Yeah, because obviously Flair and Perfect will continue. Ramon and Savage won't, but it's interesting. In an interview, I think back in 2015, Razor Ramon spoke about what he believed was meant to happen here, and he was actually not happy that the Warrior left because, to his claim, he said what was supposed to happen in the match was he was supposed to essentially break Macho Man's leg, and that would be it, and that would explain the larger transition into the commentary role. Now, interestingly, obviously, this whole knee thing with the Macho Man, they've been playing since SummerSlam. It's the reason he loses the title. If you watch a dark match between Razor Ramon and Macho Man, he's also going for the leg. So they kind of played this throughout. So I can believe that that might have been the transition. And obviously that puts extra heat on Razor Ramon. But maybe the outcome would still be, Ultimate Maniacs winning by DQ. Now, Bruce Pritchard has said he doesn't recall that, but then he doesn't recall a lot of stuff, right? And I think, there's some probably truth to what Razor was saying. It would make sense in the context of the storyline that they're building towards. And obviously Macho Man is going to still compete, but it's not going to be the same. So yeah, I think it was fine. They protected everyone. It was a great return for Mr. Perfect. Great showcase for him. And they've really, as you said, a mid-carder that everybody loved, but they did elevate him to say, look, this guy is on par with all the main eventers. So I think they achieved that mission. Up to this point, it was the best match, I would say, of the card. But did it have the same level of heat? The crowd was super hot, right?
Yeah, no, I think it did.
If it would have been Warrior and Savage, it's probably still the 8-year-old me wishing that match had taken place just for the the crowd reaction and what leading up to this. But
well, let me give you an alternative finish to this match, Fash, which kind of happens later on in the career of Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect. What if this was a ruse all along, and Mr. Perfect was still on Flair's side, and instead of obviously helping Macho Man, as you say, breaks his leg or breaks his knee, whatever, and in comes for the save Hulk Hogan? That would have been tremendous.
That would have blown. And I think at the time, because the people only had a handful of days to really know what happened in terms of the change, that a lot of people in that crowd probably still would have been confused what's going on. And to your point, when Perfect walks out, I think there would have been a lot of people still thinking, oh, is this where somebody else comes? And Perfect's played his part. But yeah, I mean, if that would have happened, Wax,
it would have had to be a main event, wouldn't it?
That would have blown off the building, and I see that would have been the last match. But then it probably would have had an impact on our current WWF champion.
Indeed.
Hulkster will have an impact on him several months down the line, but that would have been awesome. But I guess, Perfect, they're going to play the babyface role, and if you do that, you probably don't, get the kind of exchanges in the beginning between him and the villains. But yeah, that would have been a great alternative if they were going to keep, this unit together. So I'll give you that one.
Let's move on to what happens next. Obviously, we've got a couple of promos with Gene, with Flair and Ramon, who are very unhappy with the result. Tremendous Flair. I think when Flair is angry, he's like it's as good as anybody on the mic.
I think Flair's very underrated in this. We talk about the run. People just talk about Royal Rumble 1992, and we've talked about how Vince wasn't really happy with him. It doesn't really work this run, but I think his promos were great, and certainly this whole Perfect Warrior thing, I think he was excellent. And certainly the outrage they show at the end of this is brilliant, with Razor with the kind of more seething anger, and Ric Flair being amplified to 100.